follow history 363. So we left off with defeat of Philip V, who is forced to pay a Roman indemnity, deprived of much of his navy, has a much reduced army. Then at Corinth, at the Isthmian Games, Titus Flamininus has proclaimed the freedom for the Greeks, saying that all Greek cities will be autonomous, ungarrisoned, and free from tribute. And for most of the Greeks, this makes them very happy. A few Greeks that are less happy, particularly the Aetolian League, which had been allied with Rome, but now feels betrayed. And the Aetolian League feels betrayed in part because they were hoping that Rome would allow them to forcibly expand their league by annexing reluctant cities into it. But now the Romans have said, no, all the Greek cities will be free. No one will be annexed into a league if they don't want to be. So the Aetolians, therefore, have a long simmering kind of resentment against Rome. They've been Roman allies since 211, but now they've kind of been, in some ways, kind of betrayed twice. First off, during the First Macedonian War, the Romans did not really support that war, even though they were using the Aetolians as proxy forces. Philip V had inflicted heavy losses against Aetolia in 206, and forcing the Aetolians to surrender. And then Rome made a peace with Philip the next year in 205. So the Aetolians feel badly used during the First Macedonian War, and now they feel badly used during the Second Macedonian War. They had supported the Romans again. They had provided some ample infantry and cavalry forces which had been present at the Battle of Myonessus. And now, rather than getting the territorial concessions they'd hoped for, they're basically walking away with nothing. And therefore, the Aetolians are going to be key players in Rome's next big confrontation, namely the war with Antiochus the Great. Now, those of you who are taking History 362, you're pretty familiar with the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucid Empire, run by a dynasty founded by Seleucus I Nicator, Seleucus had been one of Alexander the Great's lieutenants and had ultimately fallen in after a whole sort of series of civil wars, had fallen in on much of the territory of the old Achaemenid Persian Empire. So the Seleucid Empire extends really from Anatolia all the way to the Hindu Kush, including Syria, Mesopotamia, much of the Iranian plateau. So it's a big, powerful empire. It's perhaps the largest and most populous of all of the successor dynasties to Alexander the Great. And at this time, in 194, when the last Roman garrison leaves Greece, the Seleucid Empire is ruled by one of its most energetic and militarily activist kings, Antiochus the Great. And Antiochus the Great has actually just finished sort of rescuing the empire from a period of internal dysfunction. And he's also been working on extending the empire's reach into Western Asia Minor, always kind of a periphery for the Seleucids, even when their power is at its apogee. This involves, of course, essentially negotiating in a somewhat menacing fashion with various cities in Western Asia Minor, Greek cities, who would like to consider themselves autonomous. And many of these cities, including Smyrna and Lampsacus, also start appealing to Rome, feeling diplomatic and military pressure from Antiochus the Great. Now, the Romans, from the end of the Second Macedonian War, start putting diplomatic pressure on Antiochus. Part of that is Antiochus, remember there's the so-called pact between the kings. So Philip has tried to expand into the Aegean, in Caria, against Athens, against Abydos. But Antiochus has also been expanding against the poor, sort of failed Ptolemaic state, including annexing much of Coeli Syria, what today is Lebanon and Israel and Palestine, and also annexing former Ptolemaic outposts in Asia Minor. So the Romans have, on one hand, told him, we're really unhappy with this war that you've been waging against someone we consider an ally, the young innocent child Ptolemy V. So the Romans don't like that. And of course, and they also say, you know, we also don't like the fact that you are impinging on the autonomy of the Greek city-states of Western Asia Minor, particularly Smyrna and Lampsacus. After all, when we said freedom for the Greeks at Corinth, we meant freedom for all the Greeks, both the Greeks in Europe and the Greeks in Asia. And remember, for the ancients, the divide between Europe and Asia, I mean, Asia really just refers to what we would today call Turkey, and somewhat beyond. At any rate, the Romans are sending sort of these diplomatic embassies, many actually including the sort of commission of 10 men, these decemviri. Some of them stop by and sort of scold Antiochus the Great. Antiochus the Great doesn't really listen, right? He says, yes, you know, don't worry about my war with Ptolemy V. I'm about to make peace. He's going to marry my daughter. We're about to patch that up. And he just kind of ignores them when it comes to the pressure that he's putting on these Greek city-states. Because Antiochus was a really powerful king, there's also a real problem with the Roman slogan of freedom for the Greeks. If the Romans truly pull all of their garrisons out of Greece, this leaves a power vacuum. There's really no major hegemon in Greece now. And so Antiochus doesn't really feel the need to pay attention to the Romans when they're saying, look, we're pulling out of here. By the way, freedom for all the Greeks, but we won't be here to enforce it. Our garrisons are pulling out of, say, the Acrocorinth, where there is a Roman garrison until 194. By 194, they're all gone. And indeed, in 194, Scipio Africanus has his second consulship. And Scipio Africanus really, really wants to force an engagement with Antiochus the Great, probably because he wants another war to further enhance his military glory. Now, the Senate does not really want to give Scipio Africanus, who a lot of senators think is just way too big for his britches, another opportunity for military glory. So they do not create Greece or Macedonia as a province. They do finally implement the policy promised by Titus Flamininus of the last Romans go home. And the province that poor Scipio gets, rather than a province that allows him to fight a big, glamorous, profitable Eastern war, is the province of Italy itself. And this is probably a deliberate snub by the Senate. So Antiochus seems to take all of this as, you know, the Romans, it's just talk, and they're not really all that interested in Greece or even the cities of Western Asia Minor. Therefore, when the Aetolians foment deliberately a crisis, Antiochus is willing to respond. And here this clash, the eventual clash between Rome and Antiochus the Great, after a period of kind of what Ernst Badian has even compared to Cold War, sort of hostile, unfriendly diplomatic posturing, they finally go to war, and the spark is again a minor power. And we've sort of seen this a couple times, where you know, the spark between the First Punic War was the Mamertines. The spark for the Second Punic War is Saguntum. That oftentimes minor players can, in sending out diplomatic requests, can actually shape the nature of great power conflict. So here, the spark between Antiochus and Rome is going to be the Aetolians. And the Aetolians, who again have been unhappy with the settlement, who see that the Romans are gone, they decide that they are going to try to occupy as many of the fetters of Greece as they can. So in 192, they move simultaneously against Demetrius on the Bay of Volos. And then, by the way, the fetters of Greece, for those who are taking 362, are a couple of key strategic garrisons, particularly that have been held traditionally by the Macedonian kings, including Colchis on Euboea, Demetrius on the Bay of Volos in Thessaly, and the Acrocorinth. And so the Aetolians try to stage, they move militarily against Demetrius, against Colchis, and against Sparta, where they actually depose Nabis of Sparta. He meets his end. And then they invite Antiochus the Great to come, and here they use the same slogan, come into Greece and protect the freedom of the Greeks. So basically the Aetolians have said, hey, we're done being sort of tools of Roman hegemony. That hasn't worked out for us. Let's see if Antiochus can get us a better deal. Antiochus decides that he's going to answer this call. And it may be that once the Aetolians have framed this sort of request in such a public way that he'd lose face if he said, no thanks, I've got some other things I'd like to do. So Antiochus crosses into Greece with a relatively small expeditionary force, and this fact prompts the Roman declaration of war. So now Rome and the Seleucid Empire are at war at the start of 191. All right, sorry the interruption. So by 191, both Rome and the Seleucid Empire are at war. Now poor Antiochus the Great, he's only brought a really small expeditionary force with him to Greece, probably because he may not think the Romans are actually going to respond in an aggressive fashion. After all, they've withdrawn all their troops from Greece. He's probably assuming they're not all that interested. He also seems to think that the Aetolians are going to provide him with more resources than they actually do. Indeed, he's rather shocked and disappointed when the Aetolians don't come up with the troops and supplies that he thinks they've promised him. So the Romans respond by sending a full-on consular army, roughly 23,000 men, commanded by the consul Acilius Glabrio. And Acilius Glabrio has with him, this is actually sort of unusual, a number of the military tribunes elected that year for the consular armies include very, very senior men, including men who have already been consul. Military tribune is usually a very junior office, as we've talked about. But in this year, it seems they want to try to maximize the military experience going over. And so one of those men is actually Cato the Elder, who's already been a consul in Spain, had a very successful consulship in Spain in 195. So Glabrio crosses over and is now moving through Greece, and Antiochus, who doesn't have enough troops to really confront this expeditionary force, does what many, many armies have tried to do throughout Greek history, which is to try to see if he can block the pass at Thermopylae, which is a big choke point for anyone who's trying to move kind of out of central Greece and down into southern Greece. This, of course, is tried most famously by the Spartans back in 480 BC. And there have been other attempts to hold the pass at Thermopylae, some of which have actually been somewhat successful. So Antiochus, who has a smaller force, therefore sets up to try to hold the pass, actually builds a little wall. He does actually have more troops than the Spartans had way back in the day, so that's a point in his favor. He also knows, he's read as Herodotus, he knows that the goat paths, there exist goat paths up in the mountains up above that could allow you to sort of turn the pass. And so he uses the Aetolian troops to guard his rear, so that anyone trying to infiltrate using these paths would be blocked by the Aetolians. Too bad for him, though, the Romans themselves have read their Herodotus. And so their plan is basically kind of Xerxes' battle plan, that the main Roman army is going to try to force the pass. Of course, the pass at Thermopylae back then is extremely narrow, where the cliffs coming off the mountains almost abut the sea. If you go to Thermopylae today, you'll notice the sea is receded substantially, so it's actually a huge plain where a massive army could pass through quite easily. But back in the day, it's a relatively narrow pass. So the main Roman army is going to approach the pass. Meanwhile, two flying columns, one of which is commanded by Cato the Elder, Marcus Porcius Cato, are going to try to infiltrate around in the darkness to find those goat paths and to slam into the Seleucid rear to therefore capture the Seleucid army. There's two Roman columns. One gets lost in the dark, but Cato manages to find his way. He brushes aside the Aetolians who are guarding those paths and therefore hits the Seleucid rear. Antiochus realizes he's caught between a trap, Romans on both sides. He flees with as many cavalrymen as can ride away with him, gets on a boat and sails for Ephesus, and the rest of the Seleucid expeditionary force is annihilated. So heavy losses for the Seleucids, and now the Romans are in control of Greece. Now, it's decided that Glabrio is going to stay and continue the war against the Aetolians, There's a new consul election, and the successful consul is Lucius Scipio, the younger brother of Scipio Africanus. And Scipio Africanus even says, if you assign my brother to the war against Antiochus, I will come along with him as a legate, as a lieutenant, someone who, generals have the right to just sort of bring their own council of people, in addition to, say, the elected military tribunes who serve as their staff officers. So Roman generals are always also surrounded by a group of kind of friends and trusted advisors that they can bring with them and to whom they can delegate power. And these are legates. Scipio Africanus joins Lucius Scipio. Now there's one more prerequisite. If the Romans are going to actually take the war over into Asia and take it home to Antiochus, they're going to need to achieve naval supremacy. They have an ally in this, in that Rhodes has allied with Rome. Rhodes is an island polis off the coast of Turkey, coast of Anatolia. It's actually not part of Turkey. The Rhodians have their own. They were the last kind of city-states that has a really big navy. So the Rhodians have allied with the Romans, and a Roman-Rhodian fleet finally crushes the Seleucid fleet at the Battle of Myonessus, and this gives the Romans the naval supremacy they need, so they can actually cross the Hellespont with ships and not have to worry about the Seleucid navy intercepting them. One other diplomatic coup for the Romans: Philip V has joined the Roman war effort. And indeed, Philip is someone who, early on in the war, had perhaps been teetering. Should I support Antiochus the Great? Remember, the Macedonians and the Seleucids have traditionally been friends. Those dynasties have a long tradition of friendship. But Antiochus the Great blunders early on, in that it seems that he is toying with supporting a pretender, someone who has a sort of flimsy claim on the Macedonian throne. And this pretender, he allows him to bury the dead from Kunos Kefla. Remember, I mentioned those 8,000 dead Macedonians are just left to rot, and their bleached bones are still visible when Antiochus the Great invades Greece in 192. And so Antiochus lets this pretender bury those bodies. And that seems to be a signal that maybe he's considering some kind of coup against his supposed friend Philip V, to support this other guy who has a claim that is almost laughable. This turns Philip V pretty quickly against Antiochus the Great. He realizes Antiochus was maybe not so great a friend after all, despite this pact between the kings in 204, 203. And so Philip V joins the Roman war effort on his own volition, provides the Romans with actually an infrastructure. So he actually builds roads and bridges so the Roman army can pass through Macedonia and Thrace on its march into Asia. And he also allows Macedonian and Thracians, who are his subjects, to come along as basically mercenaries, as auxiliaries who are joining the Roman army. Indeed, these will play a role in the final battle. So the force led by Lucius Scipio enters into Asia Minor. There is some kind of shadow boxing as both sides maneuver. Antiochus the Great, meanwhile, has assembled a huge army, supposedly 72,000 men, centered around, again, another Macedonian pike phalanx. Now, Scipio Africanus, the greatest Roman military genius, perhaps ever, certainly a rival to Caesar, is sick. And therefore he is not present at the final battle, the Battle of Magnesia in 190. Lucius Scipio, though, does a pretty good job. He arrays his army in the kind of horseshoe bend between two rivers near the town of Magnesia ad Ciplium, thus the name, the Battle of Magnesia. And so this somewhat makes up for the fact that he's badly outnumbered. There's these rivers that prevent Antiochus from completely outflanking him. And he has with him, in addition to his own troops, about 800 cavalry from the city-state of Pergamon, commanded by the new king of Pergamon, Eumenes II. These are actually going to prove vital. So the battle begins with Antiochus actually getting the upper hand. He charges with a special type of cavalry that the Seleucids have, cataphract cavalry, which are heavily armed horsemen, where both the rider and the horse are heavily armored. kind of a predecessor of the medieval knight. And these cataphract cavalry wedge themselves. Actually, they drive a wedge between the Romans and their sort of flank tied into the river, and they push the whole Roman left right up to the ramparts of the Roman camp. So again, the first part of the battle sees about half the Roman army, if not defeated, badly pressed. And indeed, the aid that they get as they're pushed back is some of these Macedonian Thessalian mercenaries who are tasked with guarding the camp come out and provide support to the Romans as they are getting smashed back by the Seleucid heavy cavalry. However, Antiochus is actually leading this charge. He thinks the battle is going really, really well. Turns out things are going less well for the Seleucids on the other side of the battlefield. That is, the Seleucids initially try to charge with some scythed chariots, a kind of contraption that may look good in parades or movies like Gladiator, but don't seem to be particularly effective on the battlefield. And as these scythed chariots withdraw, having been riddled by some Cretan archers that have also joined the Roman war effort, probably as mercenaries, Eumenes realizes that the retreating scythed chariots are actually disrupting the cavalry. They're spooking the cavalry on the Seleucid side. And he realizes this is what the Greeks call the kairos, the right moment, the perfect moment. And so Eumenes orders a charge with his cavalry, and it seems he's also been given kind of a command over the Roman cavalry, which is all mostly stacked on the Roman right. So Eumenes leads this cavalry charge, and this completely scatters the Seleucid cavalry, even though they're probably numerically superior. And Eumenes, having basically smashed through the Seleucid left, now turns to kind of roll up the Seleucid line, and the Seleucid heavy phalanx is therefore trapped between the advancing Roman legions and the cavalry that is now enveloping it. So too late, Antiochus, who thinks he's winning, he's like, I've got the Romans practically up against their camp, looks over and realizes that he's losing. He again retreats. A great deal of his army is destroyed. Probably a lot of his heavy phalanx is surrounded and annihilated. And so Lucius Scipio, despite not, he's of the two brothers, he's not the military genius, manages to win a solid, decisive victory at the Battle of Magnesia. Now, Antiochus has the forces to fight on. He has a huge empire. He's only suffered losses in Anatolia for an empire that stretches all the way almost to it stretches to what's now modern-day Afghanistan. But his reputation as a king has suffered some serious hits, right? Hellenistic kings are not supposed to lose and lose and lose. He's been losing and losing and losing. He's lost at Thermopylae. His fleet has been destroyed at Myonessus. And he himself has suffered another personal defeat at Magnesia. So to stop the losing, he makes peace. And the peace is quite a heavy one. He has to pay a huge indemnity, including 1,000 talents a year for 12 years, in addition to a 3,000 talent down payment. This is a huge amount of silver. And the Romans are going to use it actually for big building projects in the 180s and 170s. He also has to give up his war elephants and most of his Mediterranean fleet, and he loses all of the territory in what's now Turkey, all of the territory north of the Taurus Mountains. And Antiochus personally has devoted much of his life to restoring and expanding Seleucid control over Anatolia. And now he has to give it up. So this peace is solidified with the Treaty of Apamea in 188 BC, and the Romans have therefore humbled two of the great Hellenistic kingdoms. And the third Hellenistic kingdom, the Ptolemaic dynasty, is still weakened simply because of the fact that it's still got this kind of child king. So with the defeat with the Treaty of Apamea, Rome really kind of now has a Mediterranean hegemony. The Seleucids remain a pretty powerful empire if you look to sort of the Syria, Mesopotamia, Iran axis, but they are really done for as a major Mediterranean power. So we see Rome triumphant and dominant over the East. What's interesting, and we'll look at next time, what does Rome do after this great victory? It proceeds to basically ignore Eastern geopolitics for roughly the next 15 years or so, as the Romans become interested in other things or other areas for the deployment of their armies, particularly Cisalpine Gaul and Spain. And this actually leads to a revival in Macedonia that makes Macedonia a potentially dangerous rival again. So next time we will talk about the Third Macedonian War that leads to the final destruction of the Antigonid dynasty. I'll see you then.